Hi, Stanley here, and this game was played by Magnus Carlsen versus Liren and features the London system. So if you're a London system player or if you'd like to play the London system, this is exactly for you. Let's see how the world champion Magnus Carlsen plays the London system. This game was part of the Magnus Carlsen Chess Tour Finals, and it's important to notice, first of all, that it was a Blitz game, so the time control was 5 minutes per player plus 3 seconds of increment every move. And also, Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces was in a must-win situation. So Carlsen playing for a win, playing for the full point, a draw would not suffice in order to stay in the match. Magnus Carlsen playing d4. So the move d4 is on the board, and knight f6 played by Liren, knight f3, d5, bishop f4, c5, e3. Pretty standard so far, but here's something very interesting that happens. e6, and now after c3, bishop d6, this position was reached in a previous game during the same match as well, and we've analyzed that game too. So if you're interested, you can check out our other videos, and that game was also analyzed on this channel. However, here Magnus Carlsen, rather than going for knight b d2, which was the move that was played in the previous game, decides to do something different. Now, Magnus also won the previous game. However, that was based on a pawn sacrifice that, potentially after the game, Liren checked that with the computer, maybe prepare some defense or something. So Magnus decides to go for something a little bit different, which is bishop d3. And in the previous game, c takes d4 was played by Liren in a similar position, just with knight on b2 instead of the bishop on d3, of course. But now Liren says, okay, I'm going to go for this structure. I'm going to capture over here. I'll take your bishop on f4. Now your pawns are split and you've got a double pawn. On top of that, I'm going to put pressure on your king side immediately with queen b6. Now b2 is hanging, so queen c2 defense, but also lines up this nice battery, the queen and the bishop, potentially putting pressure on h7, which will become a very important theme of the game. And the queen from here is also putting pressure on d4, and after takes, Magnus Carlsen doesn't really want to take with the pawn. That would be pretty bad. This would be a long-term weakness, and this pawn would also be weak in that particular structure. The reason being, this pawn here is nicely controlling the e5 square. So for white, it's not so bad to have a pawn on f4, which adds protection to the e5 square, and also allows white to have a pawn on f4 and the pawn on f2 at the same time, which later on can be moved to f3, controlling e4. So white knight, the black knight rather, can't really utilize the square e4 in this game, and therefore Magnus Carlsen decides to capture with the knight, because this pawn on d4 will be very weak. Now this knight is here, and potentially the other knight might go to e5, depending on how the game proceeds. So immediately, Liren wants to exchange his knight, and of course Magnus Carlsen decides not to exchange it, because white has got very nice squares for his knights, and black doesn't really have very nice squares for his knights, as we have already explained. So the game continues with castles, bringing the kings to safety. Bishop d7, knight b d2, rook a to c8, a3 to avoid any potential b4. Of course, now that this rook is lined up on the same file as the queen, bishop b4 was a threat. And after the simple move rook e to, rook f to d8, rook f to e1, h6, because, there's a lot of pressure here by this queen and bishop on h7, so h6 played in order to avoid that, in order to avoid potential knight jumps to h5 as well. So the knight goes to e5, and we can see that this f-pawn now is protecting this knight, very important. And black decides that it doesn't really want to cope with a knight on e5. In fact, in the previous London game, that knight on e5 was such a strong piece that in order to try and remove that piece from the board, black actually lost the entire game, and funnily enough, that knight was still on the board at the end of the game. So right now, black decides, you know what, I don't want any of that, and obviously going to e4 is impossible here. So the knight goes back to e8, and after knight f3, sure, white no longer has got a piece on e5, but a pawn on e5 can be very strong unit as well, because it's preventing this knight from occupying its most natural square, f6. And if you think about that, what is this knight doing in f6? More importantly than anything else is controlling the h7 square. So right now h7 is not defended by the knight. Of course the knight it's also got other ideas from f6, from e8. Instead it's very, very passive. So black decides, hey, you know what, I'm going to exchange this bishop because this is my bad bishop, is stuck behind my pawn chain. All my pawns in the center are stuck on light squares. Let me play queen b5 and exchange it. It looks like this bishop doesn't have a lot of squares to avoid the exchange. So in a way, you could think that here maybe Carlsen could have played a move like a4, which is very possible as well, just to avoid this. But in reality, Magnus Carlsen had a very specific idea in mind. So after knight f3, bishop e5, bishop h7 check. And this comes with check, so the king gets to move. And you say, okay, we saved the bishop. However, the bishop might get a little bit stuck on this square. And is it going to favor white or black? We shall find out during the remainder of the game. a4 was played now, so really telling this bishop, hey, now you've got the diagonal. If you retreat, I'm going to retreat, and you haven't accomplished anything. So the bishop goes to a6, and it looks like this bishop is controlling an important diagonal, but is it really as important as it looks? This bishop might easily be trapped. Maybe if the queen moves, potentially b4, b5 can happen. Of course, only if the c3 pawn is secure somehow, because otherwise it would become too weak. But white decides, first of all, to remove the queen from this potentially dangerous file. And here's very interesting. Whenever you play bishop h7, you got to figure out what you do in case black plays j6. And normally here, the only way to really justify that would be to sacrifice your bishop. By playing queen back to b1, Magnus Carlsen is actually losing a tempo in the variation where black plays j6. Because here, if black is going to play g6 anyway, white might as well just play a rook move or knight move, doing something else, and then simply waiting for black to go g6 and then capturing, and then of course the queen will end up on g6 anyway. However, Magnus Carlsen is kind of inviting Ding to take on to actually play g6 and enter in this variation where white sacrifices a bishop. However, it gets a few pawns in exchange. So let's see exactly how Ding replies. Liren decides to accept the challenge and play g6. Here, other moves were possible, and with hindsight, probably better. But remember, this was a blitz game, and it's really not so easy to play with a short time control and to evaluate complex positions that are very, very unbalanced. So where one side is sacrificing a piece, and the other side has got an extra piece, but not as many pawns, and then has to defend against a pawn storm. So that's something that needs to be evaluated. So here, Liren decides to go for this. Could have played something like queen c7 or say after something like this, something like queen c7, or maybe try some d4 to open up the center. But in reality, this position is really good for white. The reason is this idea that Magnus Carlsen had can probably only be refuted by playing g6, but it doesn't work. So the whole strategy, the whole opening strategy Magnus Carlsen played is already very effective. Brilliant opening strategy by Magnus Carlsen, choosing the London system for this particular game in a must-win situation. So the queen captures on g6, and all of a sudden white has got two pawns. White is going to get another pawn here. And after queen c7, queen h6, the queens are exchanged, but here you go, knight g5 check, and another pawn falls on e6. So white has got four pawns, black has got a piece, but right now this piece is not very active. This piece is bishop on a6, which is not really doing a lot. However, Ding has got something in mind. So the game continues. First of all, black needs to save the rook, which was attacked by the knight, so rook d7. And after rook e3, immediately going after this bear king and preparing potentially an advance of some pawns in on the king side, black here would love to exchange knights. Now, even after the knight exchange, it would still be some pressure, but this knight on g7 cannot be better than the knight on d4. So the knight goes back to d4, also paving the road for this pawn to advance. And here, the other rook is activated by Ding, e6 is played. The rooks are blockading for now, but can they really? It looks like these four pawns are extremely strong. And here Ding finds this idea with b6 in order to save the bishop. When I say save the bishop, I really mean like do something useful with this bishop, because yeah, this bishop might get trapped, but in reality, white is probably even going to spend time trying to trap the bishop. And you may argue, okay, bishop go to c4, okay, but even from c4, the bishop can't really join the game. So it would have been possible for white to try that, but in reality, there's no point, because these pawns are just so fast, and it's very hard for black to stop them. So black gets the e-pawn, and Magnus Carlsen must have calculated that. Ding is getting the e-pawn, so still some fighting ideas for black. And the e-pawn is falling after rooks are doubled, and there's nothing white can do to save it, but white has calculated this is enough. So knight f5 here would be crushing. So is pretty much any other pawn move like h4, f4. So white decides to continue with h4, and after that h5, these pawns are advancing. As the pawns advance, it becomes harder and harder for black to defend. The rooks are exchanged, and here the king simply keeps advancing. It's just so hard to stop this. In fact, it's just impossible to effectively stop it. Magnus Carlsen has calculated everything. After knight takes, bishop takes, Carlsen knows exactly. So when I say it's calculated, not necessarily like move by move, but has already assessed that this position is winning for white, because these three pawns are stronger than this bishop, and there's no way for this bishop to stop all of that. And of course, there's other pawns on the other side of the board too that can be used. If this king is distracted or the bishop is distracted, somehow the king can go and collect the other pawns on the other side of the board. So king g5, and black rushes to try and stop his pawns. Here, a very interesting move. It wasn't necessary, but it's really very nice from a visual point of view. This move a5. Here, as you can see, these two pawns are just advancing, and black needs to stop them. And then these other three pawns that are not doing much at the moment are on dark squares, which means this bishop cannot attack them. However, this pawn here is on light squares, so in theory, black could try to go and capture that pawn, and all of a sudden maybe try some sort of counterplay with a breakthrough like this. Now, it's not going to happen, it's too slow, but imagine a breakthrough like this. So this is how, in theory, a breakthrough might happen. Actually, just to show you a little bit more clearly. So let's say, for example, somehow this bishop captures the pawn and then goes back to try and defend here. Black could continue with a5 first, and then b5. And here, very important, the move d4. Imagine the king is too far to defend, and after takes, otherwise this pawn becomes a passer, then the move a4 is possible, and then later b4 and a3, and that's how you create a passer on the side of the board that is far from the king. However, this is extremely slow, so it's not going to work anyway. Magnus Carlsen just decides to play super safe here and plays the very nice move a4, a5. By playing a5, Magnus Carlsen says, hey, you're not going to create a pass pawn no matter what. And in fact, after this capture, it's just impossible for black to create a pass pawn. There's no more potential breakthrough. These pawns are doubled, so if this pawn's advanced, if this pawn is advanced, simply white will capture that, and these pawns will no longer be able to break through, as opposed to the previous structure when the pawns were connected. And obviously these pawns can't do much because they can only distract this one, but this one pawn is stopping two of them. So a very interesting way, a very interesting pattern that maybe is not so relevant to the game anymore because white is winning anyway. But Magnus Carlsen did that based on intuition, knowing that with very little time on the clock, remember this was a Blitz game, it makes a lot of sense to play it safe and just shut down any potential counterplay. But in some situations, this pattern can really help you, might be very useful, because sometimes the fight for the tempi is actually a lot tighter. So maybe in some situations, it will be very useful to do something like that. And now, okay, white can continue with f4. There's really nothing black can do to stop this pawns. f5, the bishop drops back, h6. Now the king is so far from the center of the board, and the white king is walking towards the middle. One pawn is dropping, but it doesn't matter, because after king e7, simply the f pawn will be escorted by the king to promotions, and there's nothing that black can do to avoid that. So this was truly a brilliant game by Magnus Carlsen. Of course, it was a Blitz game, so you can't expect perfect play by either opponent, really. But what's beautiful is, the way he's treating the London system. Here, the main move is usually just going back with the bishop g3, which is a very good move, of course. But here, this idea, Magnus Carlsen has got, hey, and this has been played before. It's not a novelty or anything, but the way he's treating the position with this lineup, just knowing that in the future something on h7 will happen, and making sure that this knight is on exchange, very important strategic considerations by the current world champion Magnus Carlsen. And later on, understanding that h7 is really gonna get under fire after a move like knight e5, exchanging and getting a pawn. h7, h6 is not helping, because it's not just the pawn that is weak, it's the square that is weak. So here, it's not enough to go bishop b5. And by the way, obviously very principled play by Liren as well, going for this exchange, but it doesn't work. Bishop h7. And here, the sacrifice. And this is really a beautiful idea. It turns out this position is just completely winning for white. It's extremely difficult for black to defend. These 4 pawns are so strong, and this bishop will need time to come back to the defense. So beautiful game by Magnus Carlsen. And if you play the London system in your games, maybe you'd like to start how to play to start to play that, or learn how to play that better. Definitely, this is a game that you want to remember. And again, it's not so much about concrete lines or anything, but just the ideas in these games were extremely interesting. So I hope you enjoyed this video. And again, if you like the London system, or if you're learning something in these videos, make sure you subscribe to this channel, because we do share a lot more content about the London system and other chess openings and other chess concepts as well. So make sure you subscribe. Make sure you share this channel with other people as well, so that you help spread the love and you support the channel as well. And I'll be very, very happy to see you very soon. So hopefully see you in the next video. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Daniel Lupria, and see you soon.